Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Behind the Glass. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mika Fay, and I'm the Youth and Family Programs Educator here at the Corning Museum of Glass, and it's my pleasure to introduce our program tonight. Over a year ago, Maria Kennedy, the Folk Arts Coordinator at the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes, came to me and said, "Hey, I have this program idea." Glass is very closely tied to what we eat and drink, as you know. Look at the variety of drinking glasses we have. There's a shape and a size for pretty much everything out there. She wanted to pair area cider makers with area glass makers to create a specific drinking glass for a particular cider from each cidery. And tonight's program is the result. You're going to hear about cider in the region and the state, and then there will be a panel discussion, which is why we have the chair set up out front, between the glass makers and the cider makers. After the panel discussion, please return to the admissions lobby for a tasting from each cidery. So before I introduce Maria, we would like to thank her and the Arts Council for this wonderful partnership and all the work that went into it. It really took a village to put this program together, so we want to thank the cider makers and the glass makers and Troy Smythe and the Education Department for helping see this program through to fruition. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maria Kennedy. She will start us off with a look inside the world of cider. Maria has been working in the field of folklore for many years. She recently completed her PhD in folklore from Indiana University on the environmental and cultural heritage issues behind the revival of craft cider in the UK. This personal interest in the heritage of cider meshes nicely with the Finger Lakes area's rich agricultural and culinary history. Please welcome Dr. Maria Kennedy.
All right, am I on? This is the first time I've been introduced as doctor, so thank you very much. I am pleased to welcome you today to a very unique project. When I first moved to the Finger Lakes almost 3 years ago, I knew a lot about cider, but almost nothing about glass. But it struck me that these two regional art forms were uniquely positioned in our region. Where else could you find some of the world's best new cider makers and some of the world's best glass artists? First of all, let's get one thing straight. At this presentation, we are talking about cider that is fermented, not sweet cider. So just keep that in mind. Whenever we say the word cider here, we are talking about an alcoholic beverage. Yes. The interesting thing about cider, being a relatively new beverage in an upscale drinks market, is that there is no agreed upon style of glass to serve it in. You may get it in a pint glass, in a wine glass, in a champagne flute, in a ceramic mug, or even in a ball jar. It's a very adaptable beverage found in a workman's mug or on the Christmas dinner table. Angry Orchard, one of the largest commercial companies in this country, decided to get in on the design idea. Their design is an interesting contribution, especially for the mass market, but I thought we could dig deeper here with our artisans and see what other possibilities might be waiting. The results have been an exciting opportunity for artists in two mediums to meet and learn from each other. First, let's look at a few historical examples of what cider was drunk from. This is a Wassail Cup. It comes from England, where I am most familiar with the history of cider. A Wassail Cup with many handles would have been passed from hand to hand during the festival on 12th night of Christmas to bless the apple trees. Cider was also a working man's drink. These Costrels and horns from the Hereford Cider Museum are the vessels a farm laborer in the field might have taken with him to drink the cider that was part of the payment for his work. But cider was also, at least for a time in the 17th and 18th centuries, a drink for the aristocrats of England. When the Napoleonic Wars cut off trade from France, a nationalist fervor encouraged Englishmen to make their own wine. Cider, according to 17th century scientist John Evelyn, was the wine of England. You can see on these glasses here, apples and pears are etched into them to reflect the particular drink that you would have had. But they are based on aristocratic glassware from the period. But where do apples actually come from? Apples have traveled a long way to get to America. Not only were they brought by settlers from Europe, before that, they made a journey of thousands of miles from Central Asia. The wild apple forests of Kazakhstan in the Tian Shan Mountains are the birthplace of the domestic apple. John Selborne says, "Nowhere else in the world do apples grow as a forest." The 19th century traveler Viktor Vitkovich proclaimed these naturally occurring groves to be a marvelous garden where apples and pears look down on you from the trees and beg to be eaten. Or drunk. Cornell, one of our famous local universities, has been doing research on apples in Kazakhstan. There was a trip several years ago to go collect wild apple seedlings and bring them back and grow them out in our Geneva research station to learn more about the genetics of the domestic apple. So we're intimately involved with the history of the apple here in New York State, all the way from Kazakhstan. And these are some photographs just to show you what it looks like over in Kazakhstan. And here are some of the other places in the world where cider is a traditional drink. England, which is where I spent much of my time, in the West Country is where cider apples are largely grown. But cider is also made in France, in Normandy, where it's made especially into Calvados, a spirit. Oops, went too far. And it's also made in Spain, which many people are not aware of, but in the region of Asturias, it's made into a more acidic cider, and you can see how he's pouring it out into the glass from this huge barrel. That's to aerate it, almost like the way champagne is aerated with bubbles. This is aerated just by throwing it into the glass. But what about apples in America? In America, cider was the drink of the people. President John Adams noted in his diary that he also drank cider. On July 26, 1796, he said, "In conformity with the fashion I drank this morning and yesterday morning about a gill of cider. It seemed to do me some good by diluting and dissolving the phlegm or the bile of the stomach." So it's good for your health. Johnny Appleseed, legendary figure of American myth, was a real man named John Chapman. Born in Leominster, Massachusetts in 1774, he traveled across New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, planting seedlings and selling trees to settlers. He ended his days in Indiana, where he is buried. Johnny Appleseed followed the Swedenborgian religious sect, and it is possible he did not believe in altering nature through grafting trees, which is why he planted them out from seed. But regardless, his seedling orchards paved the way of westward settlement, where orchards were often the sign of the first permanent European settlement. Here in New York, apple research has long been a part of the horticultural research at Cornell University. Apples of New York was written by Spencer Ambrose Beach and published in 1905. It's one of the cornerstones of apple research among cider makers today, if you're trying to figure out what apples you've got in your backyard. Some of the varieties planted in New York that are still used by cider makers today include the Newtown Pippin, the Golden Russet, and the Northern Spy, among many others. Other varieties from England include the Dabinet, Michelin, and Kingston Black, and there are hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of apples. Finding the magic combination of heritage varieties that were prized for their cider elsewhere and those that grow well here in the Finger Lakes climate is part of the excitement of the new craft cider movement today. What if we found, grew, or propagated the perfect Finger Lakes cider apple? The map on the left shows where most of our domestic apple cultivation takes place in New York today, but it used to be that almost every farm would have had an orchard. So if you're driving around the countryside here, keep your eye out because there's a lot of old orchards scattered around our countryside. Some facts about apples in New York if you want to look those up. Agricultural heritage is an important part of our upstate identity. And just like old barns represent the bones of our agricultural past, old orchards are living forms of architecture that show how our predecessors lived, ate, and drank. And I love this quote by Cynthia Falk, who says, "New York's rural landscapes deserve attention just like its other architectural landmarks." And I wholeheartedly believe that quote. I'm going to show you some pictures of the old orchards of the Finger Lakes. If you keep your eyes open, you'll start to see them everywhere. It has been part of my project at the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes to document the places and oral histories attached to these agricultural landscapes. This is an orchard near Burdett. This is an orchard that belongs to Debbie and John Ball, just north of Watkins Glen, which probably is about 150 years old. And this is an ancient, haggard old tree in Tompkins County in an orchard off someone's backyard in Podunk Road. But what did these places look like before they became ancient? Here are some photographs from the Tompkins History Center that show orchards as they would have appeared in the early 20th century. They're very idyllic pictures, especially the ones in bloom. Even up to the end of the 20th century, small cider mills operated all over New York. Many closed after pasteurization laws were passed that they couldn't keep up with. Cider makers in this area frequented State's Cider Mill in Odessa, New York, and many still have memories of pressing apples there. And I interviewed Carl States, whose father ran the State's Cider Mill. Carl said, "Most of the old timers would bring plenty of apples, more than what they needed, and then Dad would buy whatever was left over with, or they would just take it home with them in gallons or give it away. Apples were plentiful then." A lot of people, when I was a kid, all the orchards were still in production on Connecticut Hill because the old farms were abandoned in the Depression, but the orchards were still there. So you could go up and get all the apples you wanted for free. Just go up and pick them. So old orchards are part of our past, but new orchards are part of the future that these cider makers are helping to grow in New York. And I'm going to introduce you to the cider makers that we're going to talk with today. So as I introduce you, if you could just come and join us in the front. The first is Eve's Cidery in Van Etten, New York. We have Adam Stoshek here. Can I find him around? Eve's is an orchard-based cidery producing traditional method ciders at the intersection of the Southern Finger Lakes and the Northern Appalachian Plateau. The next is Kite and String Cider. Oops, that was Eve, sorry. And we have Melissa Madden with us here today. Melissa Madden and Garrett Miller brought these 69 acres in 2008 when the fields were all in corn, wheat, and soy. And over the past few years, they've created a diverse ecological farm of which the Finger Lakes Cider House is a part. And lastly, we have South Hill Cider, and we have Steve Seelan from South Hill Cider. Steve's apples come from wild trees, abandoned orchards, and orchards with high-quality cider fruit. So thank you for the cider makers for participating in this. This is a very busy time of year for them, so I'm really glad they could take the time to do this whole project. And next, let me introduce Eric Meek, the manager of the hot glass programs at the museum. He's going to lead our discussion today. Thanks, Eric.
All right, so first I'd like to introduce the glassmaking team that worked on the project here. Starting down at the end, Dane Jack is a glassmaker here at the museum. Dane's been blowing glass for about 13 years now. Dane is a Corning native, and he actually started blowing glass on the stages here at the Corning Museum of Glass. So he learned right here, also worked at the Steuben factory, and all three glassmakers that worked on this project are particularly well suited for it because they're all perfectionists and make really lovely glassware. Chris Rochelle is also with us. Chris is from Horseheads, so also local. He began making glass at Hartwood College. He also interned at the studio, so that was the first time he worked here at the museum, was interning at the studio. And Chris also worked for Steuben. And then finally, Jeff Mack here. Jeff is the supervisor of our hot glass programs here at the museum. Jeff's been blowing glass for about 25 years. He worked at the Henry Ford Museum, at Simon Pierce. Simon Pierce is a manufacturer of really beautiful crystal and stemware, and then also at the Toledo Museum of Art. So we're really pleased to have Jeff here on the team. He's been here for a year and a half now, or so, 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. But before we get into the conversation regarding the interaction between the cider makers and the glass makers, we wanted to talk a little bit more about cider. Going into this project, I learned that I knew nothing at all about cider. It was really, really eye-opening, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to learn more about cider, what goes into making cider, what makes it so special, and what makes this region so well adapted for producing this fantastic product. And we'll just do this in the form of a few questions. And Steve, I think we're going to start with you. And just the most basic question, what got you into making cider?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't really think about it for decades, but when I was growing up as a kid, my father every Tuesday would go to what he called the cider cellar. And I never thought about what it looked like, what he did there. And then decades went by, at least 15 years, and I looked back and realized and looked into the history, and there was a barn. This was outside of Buffalo, New York, where it was very rural, a barn with an old cheese cave, and it was full of barrels of wine and cider that these farmers made. And the building was there because there was a cheese company in Buffalo that built barns with cheese caves. And then this was before refrigeration in the 1800s. And when refrigeration came about, they moved the cheese caves into refrigerators in the city, and there were these caves around. And so that's what he used to do. And then decades went by, I didn't even think about cider. And then when I ended up settling back in Ithaca, there were people making quality cider. Autumn was already producing it commercially. There was a guy named Peter Hoover who had been making it for at least 20 years and planted an orchard specifically for it. And he's the one that kind of got me into it, which dovetails into Maria's talk about State Cider Mill. Peter took me there. He would assemble a team of people who would pick apples and then all travel to that mill and would have it pressed into juice and put it in barrels and jugs and take it back home and make hard cider. And those trees on Connecticut Hill I've heard about for years, but there still are orchards like that, old orchards, that people still do go up to them and harvest the fruit. They were planted generations ago, but they're still there. And then so slowly I was spending a lot of time in wineries. I was a musician and would be drinking a lot of wine in the wineries, and so that developed my palate. I became friends with winemakers. I bugged Autumn to teach me how to make cider also, and would learn whatever I can, tasting it at the farmer's market, and little by little, organically, just decided to make a go of it. And then when I realized the quality of the cider we were making around here, both as hobbyists and professionals, that's what made me realize that I should make the leap and try and do it professionally, because we've got a great place for growing fruit. We've got people who are already making world-class ciders and wines, and it was just something I wanted to get in on. So
That's great. I think it's really interesting to think of the story of, cider here 100 years ago. The wine industry has taken over, and now that is informing the cider industry here. It's a great story and a great thing to think about. You've been making cider for what, 20 years now? Nearly?
17.
17 years. Could you tell us about the landscape of cider when you got started, sort of the scale of it nationally, and then how you learned?
Sure. When I got interested in making cider in 1999, I think probably the only ciders that you could really buy were woodchuck, which was sort of reintroduced, in this country as a beer alternative in the 90s. But it wasn't something that everybody had like in their lexicon. I was working on an orchard, and what I discovered is that every orchardist has a barrel out back. It's sort of like a rural tradition, but that product I was familiar with sort of as kind of like a rough, kind of country, unrefined, homemade thing. But I got really inspired when I read about a colleague of ours, Steve Wood, who was making cider in New Hampshire, and he had brought cider apples, traditional European varieties, over from England to plant and grow in his orchard. And when I visited him and tasted his cider, I realized, I sort of had this epiphany, that people have done this and they've selected these varieties and they can make really amazing cider. And it's been pretty cool to be watching for the past 17 years the change that's happened that I've seen here in New York and across the country, where people are gradually becoming more and more aware of cider and its history and what it can be.
That's great. Melissa, Maria talked earlier that you started with a farm, and there was basically a traditional farm. There was nothing there but corn and soybeans and wheat. So you started from scratch. I'm curious how long it took to develop the orchard. How did you decide to dedicate land to producing apples for cider?
This is on, yeah?
Yeah, you're good.
So yeah, just to say, like, we weren't the ones farming the corn and wheat and soy. What we bought was an open field. So those of you that have been to the Finger Lakes Cider House, which is our tasting room, will probably have seen that there's no open land left there. And we came at that from having just been on a big farm in Wisconsin that had taken these very deep hills and valleys in the driftless region, southwestern Wisconsin, and was very concerned about the erosion. That's where the NRCS program for strip cropping on contour actually started, because of how bad the erosion was in the 30s. And so we got schooled by this very radical farmer around perennial agriculture. So we were coming from, I had worked on vegetable farms and grain farms before that, and had become a total convert, like soapbox convert to perennial agriculture. So we bought a really beautiful farm with really deep, lovely soils that didn't have a lot of biological activity going on in the soil anymore. Had been farmed very heavily for a very long time. And the first thing we did was plant grass, actually, which made it challenging to plant anything else. But it kept all the soil in place. Our slope is steep enough that any rain event before we planted that would take all the soil with it. So trees were always part of our plan, but originally I think we were really just thinking about things in maybe a little more simple terms, about producing food that was, like, not value added at all. And we were dedicated to producing food organically. And fruit in the Northeast can be a very difficult thing to do that way. And I think cider is a really beautiful continuum of allowing the manager, like the agricultural manager, to enact certain practices that are really, really good for the soil and really good for the health of the trees, and don't necessarily produce the most aesthetically perfect fruit for the grocery store shelf. And it allows you to play with varieties and management styles and still kind of get back some of your mistakes. If you have super gnarly fruit, or if your yield is low, you might actually end up with very high quality fruit, which you can make a really interesting cider with, which, for example, last year, as you all know, was a very non-wintry winter, and then very early and very late frosts, and then an extreme drought for the rest of the summer. And we had 95% crop loss in our orchard. We were able to harvest just enough Gold Rush. That was the only variety we were able to harvest, and we only made 50 gallons of cider with our own apples last year. We did buy in apples, but it's the most phenomenal cider. I don't know what we're gonna do with this. Like, hide it somewhere for 50 years. But the quality was amazing.
That's amazing to hear. Yeah, last summer was a bad summer. It's interesting to hear that something.
It was a bad year.
It was a bad year.
Yeah.
So are ciders just made out of bad apples that you can't put in the grocery store, or is it?
No, I didn't say that.
No, and really, going into this, I didn't even know there were particular varieties of cider that were well suited for our apples that were well suited for cider. So tell us about the characteristics of a cider apple as compared to a dessert apple or an eating apple.
Right. So dessert apples, they are bred from wild apples, primarily from Kazakhstan, like Maria mentioned, and they're selected and bred to be crispy, juicy, not bitter, not astringent, not incredibly sour apples. and people who are breeding fruit for eating have been very good at that. But what they bred out of those apples are actually the properties that make them good for cider apples. And that's often bitterness, astringency. Aromatics, I guess, maybe are good for eating apples and cider apples both. So if you look at the average wild apple that you taste, it's not going to be a good eating apple. But often chances are it has very good characteristics for a hard cider, which is either really nice acidity or tannins, which allow you to ferment it dry and still retain structure and flavor.
And Autumn, you were saying that a lot of those characteristics that you want in an eating apple wouldn't even translate into the flavor of a cider?
Sure. I mean, if you think about it, so when you have an apple and you press it into juice, you have maybe a couple hundred aroma compounds. When it's fermented into cider, you can have up to several thousand, and none of those will be the original aroma compounds. So what you're loving about your Honeycrisp or your Fuji, once it's fermented, won't even be there, first of all. Second of all, the sugar, which is sort of largely what you're eating the apple for, is going to be all gone. The texture doesn't matter. And so it's really, what's left that is what makes cider really interesting. And cider varieties in England and in Spain and in France are apples that people have been selecting for centuries for those fermentation characteristics.
Wow. So is the stock for what you need for your product, is it mostly European or just old varieties that you can still find in the States? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, for me personally, I'm really interested in bringing these classical European cider varieties here, trialing them. We have over 50 varieties in our orchard now. Not all of them are keepers. Not all of them do well here, and not all of them make great apples here, but some definitely do. And that's been an ongoing project for us, and I think it will remain an ongoing project. But yeah.
Yeah, and along with that, there are apples that are native to the States, right? That we all.
Sure. So I mean, that's like a
blend.
whole other aspect, which is that any apple that you intentionally use to make good cider with, is a cider apple. Mm-hmm. And it's true that when some of our older apples were discovered and named, like the Northern Spy and the Golden Russet, people were actually making cider still, right. As well as eating those apples and, cooking with them and so on and so forth. And so we have the opportunity now to sort of rediscover them and see what they can bring to the cider.
So Melissa, you have, on the Good Life Farm, you have a tasting room. Tell us the role that the tasting room plays and how you use it to highlight your product or the product in cider in the region.
Yeah, we have a lot of brands. It's really hard to keep track. So our farm was Good Life Farm, and we opened a tasting room called the Finger Lakes Cider House because we invited several other cideries to share it with us, and we wanted a name that was a little more encompassing. And the other thing, this is totally a tangent, it was really important for us to try to get the words Finger Lakes associated with cider. And because we don't get to use the same rules that wines get to use in labeling when we go through the federal government, we often can't get the words Finger Lakes on the front of our labels. So I think the conversation going on in the cider house is how great of a region the Finger Lakes in particular are for producing apples, for making really good cider. And there are any number of places called blankety blank cider house, but that felt really important to us to kind of brand ourselves with the Finger Lakes, to try to keep reminding people of what a great place it is for that. And was that the question?
Yeah, that's
Cool. Great.
No, just to hear more about your farm and the
farm.
Tasting house.
Oh yeah, so the cider house is right in the middle of our farm. We have a very diverse farm. We raise beef and poultry and organic fruit for eating and for cider. And then inside the cider house, we serve food because, and this is another thing that I think a lot of us have taken lessons from from Farnham Hill or Steve Wood in New Hampshire, they have a really great quote, which I can't remember off the top of my head, about cider and food. But we have definitely noticed by raising food right outside the window, and like you really can drive up our driveway and see our turkeys grazing in our orchard, and then serving it to people, and then having them figure out pairings. There's just like a magical moment that kind of brings home like the real agriculture behind cider and why we're all doing what we're doing. And I think people do really appreciate being able. It took me a while, but we started letting people wander around our farm finally. It took me a couple of years to be like, yeah, you can do that, it's fine. Don't like touch anything. But it's on or it's wet or whatever. But yeah, so we have animals everywhere. They're designed to interact with the orchard. For example, we post harvest. So like we've just finished peach harvest, and thankfully 2017 was a bounty year for all fruit. We send turkeys through the peach orchard to clean up drops and to deal with overwintering adults, pest adults. And so that's process is starting for us. And when we're done with apple harvest, we'll do the same thing. And people really want to see farms. They want to see where stuff comes from. And I think we were lucky in the way we laid out our farm initially that it worked out to put the cider house right in the middle of it.
How many acres do you have of trees?
We have about 15 acres of apples.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Steve, do you have an orchard? Are all of your apples from the orchard? Or?
No, most of my apples are from other orchards, but this is my first crop this year. I have 23 rows, and about 8 of them have a really good crop on them. Right now there's 1,500 trees in the ground on 3.5 acres.
Wow.
And we're just starting to spread out from there.
So when did you plant those trees? How long does it take from when you plant a tree?
The
until
original
you have
ones went in
apples?
the ground in 2014, but unfortunately those, even though I had rodent guards on that came up to here, there was a lot of snow that then got frozen, and the rabbits got on top, and in a matter of a couple days they were girdled. So the trees we planted in 15 are actually the trees that are starting to crop, and the ones we planted in 14 are just now catching up.
Wow. So I can go to the grocery store and buy, you mentioned woodchuck, I can buy a 6-pack of woodchuck. I notice that your cider is in a wine bottle. What's going on there? Why is some cider in a 6-pack in a 12-ounce bottle and some in a wine bottle?
It's a really good question. I mean, cider really suffers from an identity crisis right now in this country. First of all, just because we have to clarify that it's not unfiltered, unpasteurized juice, which so many people in our country associate with the word cider. Mm-hmm. And if you go to a cider producing region anywhere else in the world and you ask for cider, you won't get juice. But cider for the most recent generations has been mass market varieties, all basically competitors or sort of the original introduction, which was woodchuck. And the idea behind woodchuck was that it would be like a good beer alternative for, girls or people who didn't want to drink beer. And in order to do that with a perennial crop that you can only, grow once a year and harvest and press, and is expensive to start and maintain, you really need to add water because it's as expensive to grow an acre of cider fruit as it is to grow an acre of wine grapes. Also, if you're going to be consuming cider alongside of beer, you need to have an alcohol level that matches beer so people don't unintentionally get drunk. And in this country, you can put up to 49% of the ingredients in a product called cider, not apples. I'm sorry, I didn't say that in an eloquent way, but the majority has to be apple or apple juice concentrate, which is just 51%. That's what I'm trying to say. So we don't make our cider like that. We take apples, we pick them. I've been picking for the past 3 weeks and sweating the apples in my barn, and tomorrow I'm going to press them. They don't go into cold storage. They don't sit around for a year and a half, and it's taken me, over a decade to grow my orchards up and get them into production. Mm-hmm. So We present our cider in a wine bottle because it is higher alcohol, and you shouldn't be drinking it in a pint glass. It's the natural alcohol that cider apples ferment to.
Right. So in many ways, this is much more analogous to wine
Yeah.
than it is to beer.
Sure, because beer is a grain and you brew it, and wine and grapes and apples are fruits that you press into juice and ferment. So cider is basically wine made from apples.
And I think this is a great time to turn now to the glassmaking project, because really one of the challenges and one of the things that we set out with this project was to give cider a vessel worthy of it, and to try to identify a region between wine and beer within the aesthetics of the glass and the way the glass worked, to really highlight this unique beverage. So Jeff, let's start with you. Can you tell us about your first visit with Steve and how you decided to focus on this pack basket cider?
Yeah. The pack basket with Steve, we went and we had an initial visit with all of the cideries, and for me, and I think for my colleagues, my glassmaking colleagues, it was a real educational experience. I drink wine, but I don't really have a developed palate. So we learned a little bit of the language. We learned about how the ciders in this region are made like wine and not like beer, and how it's and then we tasted it, and it does. It tastes like wine. It's not. It doesn't taste like apple cider. What I grew up knowing about cider is sweet cider. You go to the orchard in the fall and you get your jugs of juice, basically. But so I learned a lot about it, and my perception was more about the brewed cider. So that was kind of a neat part of it, is just learning about fermented cider and tasting it and learning about what I'm tasting. So the pack basket here, we decided on this product because it's different in that it is from 100% wild seedling apple trees, which, Steve, I don't know if you could tell us more about that, but essentially it's foraged. The apples
Sure.
You
Yes.
go out and hunt them down.
Right. Yeah. So if you all live around here, I'm sure you've seen wild apple trees at the edge of fields, and they just sprout up from seeds that were growing on an apple tree, possibly that someone planted in an orchard. So every apple seed that grows into a unique variety. It shares genes with each parent, but is a totally unique variety, unnamed variety. And they revert back to their wild nature very quickly because there are tens of thousands of genes. There's many more genes in apples than there are humans. And so there's a lot of genetic diversity. And that cider, originally when I made cider, I didn't differentiate. I used old orchard trees and wild trees as if they were the same. But then at some point realized that they are very different and have a lot of different properties. And I wanted to start making cider that used only wild seedling apples. So that's what the pack basket is.
Cool. Yeah.
So to take a step back, we all, the team of glassmakers, we all visited all the cideries back in April.
Right.
So we got a chance to meet everyone and get an idea of the product line. And it was really the glassmakers who chose a product from each cidery that they thought was unique and represented that cidery well. So Dane, you worked with Melissa, and I really think that your design probably changed the most. So can you tell us about where you started? What was your thought going into this project with Melissa?
Yeah, so when Melissa and we first met, we talked a lot about the glass and kind of like what qualities that might be good in a glass. And I think that from the beginning we were talking about something that would be used in a tasting room. And you can probably tell us the numbers, but a lot of glasses break in the tasting room, right?
Yeah. We first started talking about things that could bounce off of concrete.
Yeah, right.
It's like,
I would not guarantee that, but
no.
it's something that is maybe a little more durable, a little heavier. So at first I began to make some kind of heavier, thicker based glasses, and they were smaller. I think I had a lot of variety in the very beginning too.
Yep.
So we had talked about maybe 2 different ciders that we wanted to use and didn't really come to a decision until the second time we met, I believe.
Yeah.
And at that point, we picked one glass that we really liked the shape of, just how it affected the way that everything tasted. And from there, we pretty much revamped the whole project to a glass that was completely different, but I think we've really landed on something that works well for both of us.
Yeah, and we did our feedback to you the way we do everything, which was like by committee. So it was probably, I think the first round was probably very scattered, and the second round got a lot more focused.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think,
really
you know, from
good.
what I observed is, you know, we definitely considered the tasting room in the beginning as one of the design criteria, but then wound up, I think, more with a glass that was more about highlighting this. And
Totally.
the Kite string is that a sparkling cider or a still cider?
Yeah, it's a champagne style,
Champagne style.
which we learned to do from Autumn. And
So is that
Yeah.
traditional method? Is that what that's
Yes.
called? So what is traditional method? What does that mean?
I can't be the one to explain this, but I'm sitting right next to Autumn. But I will just say about this one that when it went into so cider is fermented after pressing, either as single varieties or as tank blends in large format, like 1,000-liter stainless steel vessels, and then blended and can either rust or get filtered and bottled or go through a second fermentation. And that is what happens with the champagne style or traditional method. It goes into the bottle and is given, at that point it's already been fermented to dryness, so it gets some sugar and a new yeast. Do you want to add anything there, Autumn? Doing okay?
Yeah, you're doing okay. I just
Okay.
knocked this microphone.
And so one of the things that will determine how effervescent the resulting cider is how much sugar is given at that second fermentation. And so this one is our most bubbly cider that we make, and it was given twice as much sugar to re-ferment as, say, the Funk House, which is another cider that I brought that's traditional method that you can try out there. So we made this one to be like a celebration cider because the other part of it is that it's 100% organic apples, mostly from our orchard and a little bit from one of our friends in Danby called Hemlock Grove. So this is a 2015, and it spent over 12 months on the lees before we disgorged it, which was to flip it upside down, get it really cold, crack it open, and pop the yeast out, and then cork and cage it. So it's very clean. There's no schmutz.
So I think just to like kind of let everybody know in plainer terms too that in the fermentation process, alcohol is of course one byproduct, but carbonation is as well. So that's
Thank
the
you.
whole double fermentation reason, correct?
Yeah, and also I think it creates another layer of really interesting flavors. I still feel like I want Autumn to say something about it. She's the queen of it. But, yeah.
Dean?
It's basically the champagne method. And I'll just say that there's a controversy surrounding the traditional method or the secondary fermentation in the bottle method, which is that some people think that the English actually invented it on cider. The French deny this. I'll leave it to you.
I've heard that too. And also, I want to put in perspective in terms of these production styles that Autumn has been producing ciders like this for how long?
17 years.
17 years. And you know, cider is getting a heyday right now. A lot of people are paying attention to it. Paying attention to it, making all kinds of different ciders, different qualities. And maybe my perspective is skewed because I'm in this region and I like wine. But the quality of what she was doing that long ago is unrivaled in this country. So just wanted to say that.
That's nice.
I'm just going to jump in and there's an interesting glass fact behind the supposed English usurpation of the champagne method, and that is that one of the theories behind it is that the glass that was developed in the Forest of Dean in England, because it was in a coal mining region, the technology that was able to produce the strength of bottle glass was supposedly developed there before it was developed in France, and thus that's why they were able to do this champagne method in England, supposedly, before they did it in France, because the glass technology was there. So,
Wow.
yes, little fact.
Glass and cider.
Glass, yeah. Long history here. Dane, the other thing I want to talk about before we leave this is tell us about the interesting color feature that you have in this glass.
Yeah, so if you look at the glass, it's really hard to see right now, but there is this really thin little kind of gold line that runs through in a very random pattern on the glass. And it's something that I've done before in my own work. And, you know, the last time we got together, we had kind of talked about how your branding is kite and string cidery. So just kind of happened very organically where I said, oh, look at this picture of something that I made. And from that moment on, it was kind of like, all right, well, this is definitely the color pattern, and now we just have to work on the shape.
That's part of it. Yeah. Nice. Chris, so your design, I work here at the museum. I've been here for 20 years, or been around glass for 20 years. I've never seen anything quite like what you came up with for this design. Can you tell us about your visit inspired you pushing your creativity and creating this cup?
Sure. The first visit that we took to Eve's Cidery, we talked quite a bit with Autumn before actually looking at the orchard. She walked us around the orchard quite a bit too. But,
and it was an uphill hike.
It was an uphill hike. It was a good
Hill.
workout for the team. But she had us tasting her still cider, and I remember her trying to get us to really focus on the way that the flavors would hit the palate, as well as the way they would leave the palate, and everything that went into all those flavors, the intricacies. And there was one thing that she said that really resonated, and I took away with me, was that she said their product really focuses on going from orchard to bottle. And that really kind of stuck with me, thinking about, the quality of the trees, the quality of the soil that's growing the trees, and the apple itself, the quality of that when it comes off from the tree, going into the pressing, and then ultimately coming into a glass. So I wanted to really make something that embodied that concept and really kind of capture an apple tree, in a sense, in a glass to create something that had that aesthetic.
So that was lovely to see developed. And then on your second visit, what happened?
So the second visit, we had sent, I think I sent 4 samples, different shapes, to Autumn. And when we got there, we all did a tasting out of the different shapes. And the one that we settled on was the tulip shape top. And compared to a normal just bowl shape that you can see front on the top left slide there, that's more of just a traditional wine glass shape. The tulip shape really did concentrate the flavor in a different way, and Autumn can describe this pretty well. And it made such a difference, an undeniable difference, the way the flavor was presented out of that shape as opposed to the traditional wine glass shape.
And Autumn, is this also a sparkling cider? Or?
So this cider is still. Mm-hmm. And a still cider doesn't have the support of the effervescence to give it interest and mouthfeel. So it better be made with good apples, or else there's not going to be too much there. So it's kind of like a naked cider. I thought it was really cool when we first opened the box and saw what Chris gave us for samples, because I remember telling him, it's really important to me that, the shape of the wine glass helps to concentrate the aromas and give it an elegant feel. And we really, we drink our cider out of wine glasses. But at the same time, when we have guests at our house, at the same time, like at the end of the workday, like we drink it out of ball jars. And cider has, really is rooted in agriculture. And so we don't want to be pretentious about it. And it really struck me that he just captured that aesthetic really perfectly. But can I keep talking?
Yeah.
Okay. So we all were like, we pretty much voted on like the glass that we liked, and we were just focusing on the aesthetics. It was, oh, look, there's a tree inside of here, and like the shape, and we just thought it was great. And we had some guests staying with us. Actually, our guest, used to be a famous sommelier at a very famous restaurant in New York, and I thought, oh, I'm going to share this project, And we poured the cider in the glasses, and she immediately picked up on it and said, "Oh, would it taste really different in the glasses that have this thing on them?" And we hadn't even thought to think about the taste, you know? And that's when we had to rewind everything and sort of say, okay, well, we're attached to this look, but it was it was clearly a superior experience from a sensory perspective.
I think it's just amazing. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
We had actually corresponded through email a couple times before our second visit, and she had said that. I numbered the glasses before I sent them out, so I knew which shape was what she was talking about. And she said just that one really did affect the flavor, and that's the one that they were really leaning towards. I was hoping it wasn't, because I really liked the other shape more. But when I got there, it really was undeniable tasting it. So
you were a believer then?
I was a believer.
Okay.
I think it was also, when we were all there for the second visit, it was really interesting to see that, you chose the stovepipe glass for the still cider. But then there was kind of a second choice, too, that was for the sparkling cider. It was a very different shape. It was almost like a Stella Artois glass. And just seeing that, when we went into this project, I think I thought we would find the cider glass, or the cider glass for each company. But actually, there's lots of different cider glasses because there are lots of different ciders. And I think that was something that was really eye-opening for me, too.
So we're getting close to time for questions, but Jeff, Steve, can you talk a little bit about how you guys landed on the form that you have here for your glass?
Similar to the other guys, I sent Steve some samples, and then we did a second visit after he had a chance to have a look at them and try them out. And I kind of sent you a variety. Some of them had, texture on it because we knew there was some sediment in the pack basket, and we thought, well, maybe I thought maybe we would want to hide the sediment. And then you had said, and I think I remember you exactly saying, I want the glass to be invisible, so it's nothing. It features the cider, and the cider is the what's being presented there. So we pared everything back. There was nothing decorative at all. Steve, I think you sent me a picture of a Riedel red wine glass. Just very simple. It's the most simple, elegant design you could make in glass. There's no special effects. And so this is this is the shape we decided on here. So you see it has the taper like most of them do. And I think that's, it seems to be a good way for the ciders to bring the aroma to your nose. And then Steve liked the little flip on the lip because of how it hits the nose. It doesn't, just stop. It kind of invites your nose.
Right, it's like you can get right inside of
Into
it,
the
so
glass.
you can get more aroma.
Yeah.
There's a lot more aroma that you can perceive that way. Even more so, it's not just the diameter of it, but the fact that it gets constricted and then comes back up. And I think it's because it keeps the aromas of the cider in the bowl, but then it allows you to get right in there, and it separates the aroma of the cider from the air around. It's the only thing I'm guessing, but
I think Steve has such a unique approach to crafting his ciders, and it was interesting that the glass was all about his path to enjoyment of the beverage, the way that he enjoys it, and sharing that moment, that process, enjoying the beverage with other people who use this glass.
a lot of it had to do with the way it feels too. I like a certain length stem, it's not the way it looks at all. It's just how it fits on my hand and where my fingers are, and then also how it fits on my face. I don't know, it's very tactile thing.
I felt when we visited you, Steve, that there was almost a sense of that you wanted to make a glass that embodied how Steve drinks cider. It's almost so it's a very different sort of aesthetic approach than the other two projects, which was a really interesting difference.
And I just want to take a moment to recognize the extraordinary effort that went into making these glasses, but also the years of sustained extraordinary effort and dedication that goes into making these ciders. This is really something that could only happen right here. We are all so lucky to live in a region where we have extreme talent on so many levels, where occasionally things come together to create something really beautiful. And before we take a question, let's give our folks here a huge round of applause. For recognition of a really unique product with a fantastic base and heritage and some beautiful glasses that were the result of that. So again, we're at a time for questions. Troy has a mic over here. Before you ask your question, please wait for Troy to get there with the mic. Raise your hand high. 2 mics. Uh-oh, mic trouble.
Mic trouble. Mike not in trouble anymore.
I'll start out. Oh, you got it?
Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to relay the questions. Go ahead.
The question is, what next? I mean, you had some great designs here, great ciders.
Right. What next? We have great designs. We have great ciders. Where does it go from here? In terms, I can speak with the glass. In terms of the glass, we really wanted to just get to a place where we developed something that really highlighted, that focused attention on the cider. This was really a vehicle to get people here and to get the conversation going about it. The museum is not in the manufacturing glasses, but you never know where these thoughts and where these designs will lead in the future. In terms of cider, I don't know, what's next?
Oh, I wanted to say something about the glass.
Yeah, please.
So I'm going to apply to work for the museum next. Well, something you said to me about this project that I thought was really important and what made it really resonate. Is something wrong with my mic?
Yeah, it's sounding a little funny.
Okay. Well, what?
Chris,
For
does
me?
yours work?
Batteries.
It's probably batteries. I'll
It
stop.
doesn't sound like batteries.
I don't know.
Try this one.
Was just the
Freedom.
the way that we could all support each other's craft, and that Dane is, I don't think you're young, but like you're a young artist, right? And we're a young cidery.
Got to keep a little bit of mystery here.
And that we could there is possibility for collaboration, especially for us here.
Do what we have to do.
I think while they're untangling over there, one of the things that's most extraordinary about the cideries, the cider makers around here, is how collaborative everyone is. And I think that getting to know one cider maker is like getting to know all the cider makers, because you all just work together so much, which you could see from the interactions here. So,
Can I say one thing on that? From my perspective, what's next for cider is that every good host in the Finger Lakes has a craft beer, a nice local bottle of wine, and a good local cider in their pantry to entertain their guests with.
Very nice.
and the cider makers are taking orders today, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. This evening, we're not going to be selling bottles of cider here, but we are taking orders for bottles of cider here. Okay, any more questions? Yes.
Buy the glasses.
The glasses are not for sale. This was a project that we did just for this. If you stick around till the end, though, you may have a chance to wind up with some of the glasses. So that's kind of our hook for staying.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed this talk. My question is actually about the yeast. Do you use native yeast that's on the apple, similar to the wine process with yeast on grapes, or has anybody studied the variety of yeast? And if you couldn't tell, I'm a microbiologist.
I don't think anyone has studied the yeasts on the apples around here. I'll let everybody speak to what they use. The way I do my fermentations, I don't do anything to kill any yeast ahead of time, but for the most part, I've been pitching yeast. Although last year I decided to do some experiments, and I pitched different levels of yeast to see if I could get wild yeast and pitched yeast to interact. And it was interesting that it seemed like no matter how little yeast I pitched, they would ferment at about the same rate. But I did some tanks with adding no yeast, and they were incredibly slow. So I'm certainly going to use a lot less yeast in the future.
I have a question over here.
Thank you all so much for coming. I love the collaboration of crafters associated with the land and with cuisine and beverage and with the material of glass. In looking at the way that these vessels were formulated for a particular beverage, I'm wondering if the vintage has any impact on the flavor and then the actual tasting experience, and if that'll change year to year. So it's kind of a question more oriented towards the cider makers. How does the vintage affect the flavor profile from year to year of your bottles?
It's a good question. So the kind of cider that we all make is a cider that is made vintage by vintage, different from supermarket six-pack cider, which is made from a commodity like apple juice concentrate, which has no vintage. Unfortunately, at this point, the TTB, which is the regulatory agency for the federal government, does not allow vintage dating on cider. And so it's challenging to communicate to the consumer that there even is vintage variations. So thank you for recognizing that. Y'all remember last year? It didn't rain for 4 months, and now it seems like it never stops raining. So obviously, we're not like growing our apples in a hydroponic greenhouse. Every year is different, and some years there's more sugar, some years there's more acid, and that's the exciting thing, I think, that the consumer has to look forward to, is to say, gosh, I have, Eve Cidery Northern Spy from 2014 and from 2015 and from 2016, and now I'm going to make my own sort of sensory analysis about what that variation is.
We probably have time for one more, and then we should go to the raffle. Just because we're going to shut off questions now doesn't mean you can't ask the panelists questions later, because they'll be at the tasting up in the admissions lobby, and so I hope you'll join us there as well.
My question is really for the glassmakers. I find it interesting that you all landed on somewhat similar shapes, and I want to know if you studied how the shape of glassware affects taste and aromas, or if it's kind of a coincidence. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but is there sort of a science or some type of method in devising a shape of glassware to enhance what it is that you're consuming?
Well, personally, and I can say, going through a variety of shapes just to kind of start up the project in the prototyping phase to see aesthetically what was working. But then once we got there and actually tasted out of multiple shapes, different sizes, height, depth, the tulip shape and whatnot, I think it was, for me, definitely a learning experience in that actual tasting with the cider maker and, all of us that were there taking part of the tasting.
And I think too, the shapes are a result of taste, but also perception. And having somewhat of a stem. I think that's not where everyone started, but we kind of wound up there just to elevate the perception of the product and the enjoyment. That's a fair statement, I think. Or,
Yeah.
Maria.
Oh, I just wanted to make sure that, are we about to wrap up?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I just want to make sure that before we wrap up, that you all know about Cider Week, which is coming up, September 29th through October 8th, 2017. There will be lots of events around cider here in this very region, so make sure to go to ciderweekfingerlakes.com and check out all of the different tasting and eating and drinking opportunities and learning opportunities. Talk to all the cider makers about what they're going to be doing. It's going to be a really fun week.
And once again, another hour of tasting following up here. So back up in the admissions lobby, we'll be doing tastings again. And back upstairs, yeah. And now, for the fun part, for the surprise of the evening, everybody has a raffle ticket, right? How many of you have come to a hot glass show and been part of a raffle? Yeah, we're keeping it going tonight. And what I'm going to do is I'll give... Actually, before we do this, how about one more round of applause for our amazingly talented panelists. This is really an important part of our region. These are folks who work really hard doing something they love, something they're very passionate about, something that's very unique to here. Tell your friends about this. Cider is, for me, it's a whole new world. It's an amazing beverage. It fulfills a very unique place between beer and wine. It's really an amazing, amazing thing. So I encourage everyone to get to know it better. And with that, Steve, I'm going to have you select the first ticket, and we're going to be giving away a set here of pack basket and 2 of the handmade glasses. All right, so lucky winner. I'm going to read off the last 3 numbers. Who has 4, 9, 8? All right, congratulations. Excellent. I know who that is, so nobody try to fool us. And Autumn, for the Albee Hill cider, this is a still cider and Chris Rochelle's beautiful glasses. I guess I need that ticket. All right. This one, the 5s have a chance. Last 3 numbers, who has a 5, 4, 8? Hey, congratulations. And Melissa, mix them up well. Oh, there's one that hopped right out. All right, and this one is 5, 5, 0. 550 right down here in the front row. Congratulations. So, if you have any more questions, join us back up in the admissions lobby. Everybody, thank you so much for coming this evening. We hope you learned something about cider, enjoyed some lovely, unique glass making. There are sets of cups up on the tables, too, if you want to talk to them. Glassmakers will be up there, too, if you want to catch them. Please, everybody, come up, have a glass of cider, and a chat.